The way that the ministerial search process is set up in our Unitarian Universalist Association is that there's a specific date in early April when ministers and congregations can make and accept offers to each other about ministerial job placements for the next year. And that means starting kind of last month and for the next month or two, we're right in the middle of ministerial search season, myself included. And I didn't realize until I wrote the sermon this week, kind of the irony of reflecting on unemployment in the middle of ministerial search season. I love congregational life, though, and when I feel overwhelmed by the long and complicated hiring process, I turn for perspective to one of the first jobs I had after I moved to Atlanta. Not the bartending gig where they fired me before the ink had dried on my W-2 form, nor either the haunted house on North Avenue where I played a zombie bridegroom. The enduring image for me from my first year in Atlanta, an image that stuck with me at each turn in contemplating this sermon, is of driving a minivan around the poorly marked streets in a housing project of one-story duplexes in southeast Atlanta at 4:30 a.m. with cold rain driving down around me and an angry dialysis patient yelling unhelpful directions at me over the phone. This moment epitomized for me the stresses and despair of having a low-wage job in our current economy. You see, when I first moved to Georgia, fresh out of divinity school with 2 Ivy League degrees in tow, I took an online EMT training course to try and get a job to support myself in the intermediary period while I was supporting my partner in completing her medical residency. The EMT certification turned out to be less helpful than I thought, and the only job I could find with health insurance was driving the 4 a.m. to 6 p.m. shift for a Medicaid transportation company. It turns out leaving the house at 3:30 is one way to beat the traffic in Atlanta. The bitter irony of this, of course, was that once I got to work, I had to turn around and be in that traffic for most of the morning and the afternoon. So with the caveat that I only did that job for less than a year and never really faced the prospect of it as a long-term way of life, I can say that job taught me a good deal about what low-wage work looks and feels like in our country. It feels like a sore tailbone and back from sitting in one place for 40 hours a week. It feels like the constant risk for a migraine from not being able to establish a healthy sleep schedule. It feels like a persistent low to medium level of stress because of being constantly behind on an unrealistic assigned schedule. The one upside was that I had time to catch up on my off-season NFL news podcasts, which helped me to win a fantasy football league for the first time this year. It was a UU clergy fantasy football league. So that's a little bit like winning duck hunt when you shoot 6 inches from the screen. But it still counts. I'm describing what non-emergency medical transportation felt like for me as a job, but from what I understand from friends who work in Amazon fulfillment warehouses and different types of call centers, these experiences are somewhat representative of a very broad swath of millions of folks in the American labor force these days. In fact, I think these friends who I'm mentioning, or myself, we might not have taken those jobs at all if our food stamps or electronic balance transfer cards, as they're now known, had been enough to live on. It's difficult for me in those circumstances, as Gibran says, to love life through labor and thereby to be intimate with life's inmost secret. That's a hard thing to do under those circumstances. It is trying to overcome such difficulties, but those are the circumstances when our congregations can sometimes be most helpful. I think back on experiences in my life, and I invite you to think back on experiences in your life when communities of meaning have been there and when there have been helpful groups that were what you needed. I'm thinking, for instance, of the First Religious Society in Carlisle, Massachusetts, Unitarian Universalists, the support group that they host for unemployed and underemployed folks. This support group began back in 2010 when I was doing my ministerial internship there, just as it became clear that the effects of the Great Recession were here to stay and not just cycling out after a year or two. I'd like to say that it started at that time because of my ministerial internship, but in my infinite hubris as a young minister, I said thanks, but no thanks to the opportunity to be part of getting it off the ground. Instead, it was spearheaded by my supervisor, Reverend Diane Miller, former director of ministry at our Unitarian Universalist Association. In my defense, downtown Carlisle hardly seemed like the kind of place where this sort of group was going to take off. It's only about 5,000 people in that town, and it has the highest percentage of folks with PhDs of any municipality in the country. But Diane was clever enough to pitch the group as a networking resource as well as a support group. And before the year was through, folks who had been coming for networking purposes to begin with were testifying to levels of support there that allowed them to be vulnerable in ways they had never been anywhere else in their lives, including with their families. One of the advisors I was working with to support our youth group came to me and told me that he felt able to ponder things in that group he never would have thought possible. The unemployed and underemployed group had allowed him and others to be vulnerable in ways that they could not and probably should not be on their own. Having an understanding and trustworthy group to open up to helped him and others to admit they were going through a hard time. Doing it in a UU context gave them the language to talk about how it was impacting their sense of dignity. In addition to the first principle of Unitarian Universalism telling us that each person has inherent worth and dignity, something that we sometimes need to lose in order to find in ourselves. The seventh principle states we are part of the interdependent web of existence. Again, we don't always do such a good job of seeing our own dependence, which our interdependence claims we have. We perhaps prefer to think of ourselves as those upon whom others are dependent. But conditions like unemployment and underemployment strip away those pretenses and make us acutely aware of our own dependence. Being unemployed during the first 5 months of cohabitating with my partner made me realize in a real hurry what it meant to depend on someone else to make a family life together. And being a devoted and effective businessman who was out of work for the first time in his adult life taught that youth advisor from our congregation what dependence and vulnerability felt like also. He was then able to pass on to our congregation's high-achieving high school students a sense of that, which was sorely needed as they went through the high-stakes, high-pressure, high expectations process of college applications. The inspiration and title of this morning's service comes from another period of high unemployment in American history, A sermon with this same title was preached by John Haynes Holmes at the Community Church of New York during the Great Depression. I mention Holmes at this juncture because he had some helpful answers to the question of what to do if you are unemployed or underemployed. And hubristic young minister that I still am, I would like to add a couple suggestions of my own. Holmes wrote that there were 4 things he would primarily focus on if he were unemployed. First of all, he said he would be willing to accept charity. Hard as that may be to do, I advocate pursuing it in all forms. This includes things like a Facebook post that one of my multiple higher degree holding unemployed young adult friends made last summer, stating she would accept charity in the form of travel fare for her to come and visit or couches to crash on once she was there, putting herself in the position of building her social support network even as her professional network perhaps was stagnating. So put yourself out there and be willing to accept help in difficult times. The Minister's Beneficence Fund is here for folks in need. Holmes said in the second place, he would be willing to take any honest work that came along. Rereading that sermon this winter made me feel better about the time I spent during the last few years as a pub trivia DJ. Holmes's last 2 proclamations I have a little bit more of a struggle with. They were educate oneself about the broader causes of the labor situation and organize for better conditions with those situations. Holmes was a socialist. It's not that I disagree those are good things to do regardless of one's employment status. I just wonder if the implied judgment that anyone who is not doing those things could be doing more to improve their situation is shaming of those who don't have the leisure to fulfill them, regardless of whether they are out of work. Food for thought. I also think that without a mature and viable alternative to capitalist dogma, as socialism represented during Holmes's era, educating oneself about the situation takes on a whole different meaning. Some theorists and writers, including at strikemag.org and The Atlantic, have begun to ask what adjustment we should make in our attitudes towards work in an era when technological progress has made it possible for us to support ourselves with far fewer hours per week worked, when the severe increases in per-hour productivity are beginning to create perhaps less of a need for full employment as we've previously defined it. My favorite emergent suggestion put forward by some writers and ambitious politicians around the world is a guaranteed minimum income. This would mean that each person in a given country would receive the poverty level amount, just paid directly to them each year, so that everyone would have at least that low bar of income, regardless of whether they were working or how much they were making. Progressives are enthusiastic about the possibilities for wealth redistribution, and some conservatives are beginning to make the case for it as a more efficient delivery of welfare than the bureaucratically nightmarish administration of 70-something means-tested methods spread out over the country. And we would only have to double our current social welfare spending nationally, so fingers crossed. Also, a shout out to conservative economist Scott Winship, whose parents, Ray and Connie, are my fellow members at the Waterville, Maine UU Church. So we've got a theoretical approach, and also there are a new generation of activists bringing perspective to this that is leading them to take steps like mass strikes and advocacy for fast food workers asking for higher minimum wages. The hashtag Fight for 15 campaign advocating for a $15 minimum wage for fast food workers and others has been quieter than the Black Lives Matter movement over the last couple years, but arguably produced more results in terms of outcome and legislation. I hope that our congregation will find ways to support this worker-led movement for more livable wages going forward. Both of these theoretical and activist approaches are in their nascent forms at this point, and so I choose to give more leeway in light of that to folks struggling with those latter two instructions from Holmes. The part I would like to add is a plea for empathy on the part of the millennial generation. Millennials will be affected by the Great Recession more than any other group, thanks to its timing, although we know that there are many across generations who have suffered because of the economic downturn. We millennials are known as folks who need to be doing something that matters, who need praise, who are highly self-reflective, and tons of free time for introspection has only accelerated some of these latter trends. That intense self-reflection may yet produce some great self-awareness, some great art, some great transformative justice making. But for now, as much as I love Lena Dunham and girls, I think the jury is out as to what the effects are going to be. Either way, the long-term result of the economy's swift and sudden downturn in 2008 will be that a whole generation of folks are disadvantaged in the economy. Folks who were already well on our way to being overinvested in angstily assembled and branded Facebook profiles will now have gads of insecurity and fear thrown in on top of that on our development. So if you are a millennial, please take time this week to feel safe and secure, to intentionally be in that place and to pass the feeling along to a friend. If you are not a millennial, please take the time also to think empathic thoughts about young people who have been buffeted for almost 8 years by economic forces outside of their control, and to extend those thoughts explicitly to them as you are able. So those are nice things that we can do as individual Unitarian Universalists, but how do we make our congregations welcoming and ready places for folks who are suffering in this way? How do we make them ones in which we live out our values and our compassionate communities? I think it is important, firstly, to recognize that we are being such places just by existing in our current forms. I can say from experience, there are many Sundays where in my travels, in my life, a UU congregation just to attend worship at has been what I needed. Those congregations may have been disappointed not to be able to offer me the opportunity to serve on a committee or outreach team, but I was not. Too often we think of our communities as conveniently assembled recruiting grounds of fellow activists who we just need to convince to move in the right direction. The practice of simply being with each other, not needing to move in the right direction, is an important and difficult one. And it helps us to build the beloved community. We are called to love ourselves and each other as much as the rest of the world, and the more we take the time and energy to do so, the more we will be able to effectively welcome those who would seek us out as a refuge in difficult times. This is one major way in which I believe leadership in justice work has changed since the era of John Haynes Holmes I spoke about earlier. Whereas he was a founding board member of both the NAACP and the ACLU, I believe that the highest form of activism in our time involves coalitioning in community. For example, a small group justice ministry model encourages the formation of socially connected, mutually trusting groups who discover their collective passion for specific social justice goals by working and learning together. National organizations with strong individual leaders will always be important, but the work of living a liberatory call to make the world a better place rests now, as it always has, in our hands. I will leave us, therefore, this morning with the words of Aboriginal activist Lilla Watson. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you are here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Peace, salam, shalom, and may it be so.